Hello, hello, hello. It's Dr. DiMaio. We are back into our nervous system part 2. This is part 2 of your nervous system. We already uploaded this in Blackboard as a plain PowerPoint. I am making the narrated version. So this part is really going to cover things associated with the synapse and nerve conduction and the propagation of an action potential, and talks a little bit about the speed. We'll talk about saltatory versus continuous conduction. This is a beautiful picture of a synapse. You've seen this type of thing already because we talked about it with the muscles. This is a presynaptic neuron. That would be called a presynaptic neuron. And this is the postsynaptic membrane of a neuron right here. Or it could be a muscle. It could be a gland. But it says this is the postsynaptic neuron, so it's talking about a neuron here. Presynaptic is like the quarterback, he's going to throw the ball. Postsynaptic is like the receiver, he's going to catch the ball. The throwing of the ball actually has to do with a nerve conduction traveling all the way down the membrane. And then at the very end, something happens. So if you notice here, we have these synaptic vesicles filled with the neurotransmitter substance, whatever the neurotransmitter is, it doesn't matter in this case. That neurotransmitter substance is going to be released when it's stimulated. When the action potential travels down the full length of the membrane of the axon, comes to the axon terminals, and this is the terminal end bulb that you would see. And inside each terminal end bulb is filled with these synaptic vesicles. And then it has receptors here. Now we're going to talk about all the receptors and ion channels that travel down the axon, similar to the way it was in skeletal muscle, voltage gated. And over here at the very end is a calcium ion channel. When the voltage comes down from the action potential and it's strong enough, it'll come all the way, it goes all the way or not at all, it would cause calcium ion channels to open. There's more calcium outside, so the calcium ion rushes inside. When that calcium ion rushes inside, literally what it does, it causes a transformational change of the synaptic vesicles, and they come towards the end here, and they release the neurotransmitter substance out. So it's like a conformational change of the vesicle due to calcium coming in. The calcium came in because of the voltage change, and that's how you release the neurotransmitter. Hence, another reason why you need calcium ions. I mean, I always sound like an infomercial for calcium, but I always said nerves can't work. It means your brain can't work. And that means your muscles can't work. But muscles can't work because of calcium. The heart can't work because of calcium. But nerves can't work with it because if you don't have enough calcium, they won't work. If you have too much, it can actually cause problems. So calcium is a key ion. Notice it's 2+, right? It's a calcium ion, and that calcium ion comes in and has a major role in nerve transmission and conduction. So in order for the neurotransmitter to be released out into the synaptic cleft, that neurotransmitter has to be released, and it's because of the calcium that binds to the vesicle, and it releases it out into the synaptic cleft, and then it would be taken up by the postsynaptic ligand-gated, that's supposed to be ligand-gated ion channels. And this would be whatever that ligand is. In this case, it could be norepinephrine, it could be any neurotransmitter taken up, and then it causes gates to open, and then sodium ions rush in, and it depolarizes this membrane, which travels down. Okay, so we know that the neuron is the only nerve cell that can propagate and generate an action potential, meaning that you have neurons and neuroglia. The neuroglia, the 6 types, 4 in the central nervous system, 2 in the peripheral, they cannot generate an action potential or propagate an action potential. Only the neuron is. So the neuron is the structural functional unit of the nervous system. And most neurons in the peripheral nervous system have chemical synapses. That's what we just discussed. That was a chemical synapse where the chemical synapse triggers a graded potential on the postsynaptic membrane, which will start another series of events that will trigger an action potential. So in review, we have a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic cell or neuron. And the presynaptic neuron is going to send an impulse down its axon, release a neurotransmitter at a chemical synapse. That neurotransmitter can either excite the postsynaptic neuron or it could inhibit it. If it excites the postsynaptic neuron, it's going to cause a depolarization event. And depolarization is exactly what it sounds. It's going from a polarized state to a non-polarized state, which would be 0. So the resting membrane potential is usually minus 70 millivolts. When it goes from minus 70 towards a certain number, it will trigger voltage-gated ion channels that go all the way down and continue depolarizing the membrane one step at a time right after each other. And that's an excitatory postsynaptic potential. So step 1, the excitatory neurotransmitter is received at the postsynaptic neuron. So excited neuron received at the postsynaptic neuron. Step 2, the postsynaptic neuron will depolarize, and then what happens first is a graded potential occurs on that postsynaptic that's going to be traveling towards the axon hillock. If that graded potential is strong enough to meet what's called threshold, and threshold is minus 55 millivolts. If it meets minus 55 millivolts where? At a certain location called the axon hillock, which is also known as the trigger zone. And then if that happens, it will trigger an action potential that will travel all the way down the axon. Okay, so a synapse is a specialized site where a neuron communicates with another cell. You have the presynaptic neuron, which sends the message. The postsynaptic neuron receives the message. So with an electrical synapse, the two cells are in direct contact. There's no synaptic cleft or space, like in cardiac muscle cells completely attached to each other through the intercalated disc, and then the ions flow from one cell to the next. There's no need for a neurotransmitter. With a chemical synapse, the signal is transmitted across a gap, which is the synaptic cleft, and it's associated with a neurotransmitter substance that's released and one that's taken up by receptors. So this is the telodendron. The last part of the axon forms the telodendria, or terminals, and then this is the terminal end bulb, which has synaptic vesicles within. The synaptic vesicles are released out into synaptic cleft. Not that too much. A chemical synapse is the most common type of synapse between neurons. Only type of synapse between neurons and other cells. Cells are separated by synaptic cleft. Presynaptic cell sends the message. The postsynaptic cell receives the message. Now, there's different types of chemical synapses. Like we already learned about the neuromuscular junction in skeletal muscle, but there are also neuroglandular junctions, a synapse between a neuron and a gland. And then there are electrical synapses, which are associated with presynaptic, postsynaptic membranes locked together. We talked about that. Ions pass directly through, and the local current affects both cells. The action potentials are propagated much quicker with an electrical synapse. These are a huge difference in speed of the transmission of an action potential. It is found in some areas of the brain, especially the eye and the ciliary ganglia, but also in cardiac. Now, we're going to review the plasma membrane cell membrane potential. We've talked about this, that every cell in the body has a resting membrane potential. And the cell membranes produce electrical signals by ion movements. That's how the nerves work. So at rest, there's no electrical signal going anywhere. It just has this resting membrane potential. And it's particularly important when we talk about neurons. Okay, so resting membrane potential, a membrane potential of a resting cell. Graded potential is a temporary localized change in the resting membrane potential caused by a stimulus. And action potential is an electrical impulse produced by a graded potential, and then it propagates along the surface of the axon all the way. Okay, so resting membrane potentials, there's three important concepts. The extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid or cytosol differ greatly in ionic composition. Your extracellular fluid contains high concentrations of sodium and chloride. Inside your cell, the cytosol contains high concentrations of potassium and large negatively charged proteins, and also it will have lots of phosphates. Cells have a selectively permeable membrane, and the membrane permeability varies by ion. So a membrane potential, there is a passive process where movement is going back and forth from inside and out. We talked about the passive movement of ions through ion channels, through protein ion channels, and also large facilitated proteins. There is a passive movement, and there is some resistance because the membrane restricts certain ion movements. If the resistance is high, the current is small. So this slide is trying to tell you the difference between the chemical gradients. What is a chemical gradient? A chemical gradient means there's a difference in chemicals. All right, so we have chemical gradients, we have electrical gradients. In this side, they're showing you there's a difference in types of chemicals here. So for instance, this protein is pretty large, but it carries a negative charge. It's not easily in and out of the cell. It's not going to go out very easily, so it kind of gets trapped inside more than going out. And then this chemical is a positively charged chemical that's leaving, and it's potassium. This is specifically for potassium, this channel. So you have potassium leakage channels, and there's not many leaking out. And then you have the sodium leakage channels coming in. There's not that many leaking in. And so what it's saying here is that the intracellular concentration of potassium is relatively high. So in other words, potassium is of a higher concentration inside. More potassium here. Okay? Let's erase that. What am I doing? So there's more potassium inside than there is outside. And they do leak out, some leak out through the leakage channels, but the extracellular fluid, or outside the cell, has higher concentration of sodium ions. So there's a concentration gradient of more sodium outside. That's something to remember. There's more sodium outside than inside, and there's more potassium inside than outside. So as a result, since there's more sodium ions outside than inside, there's 3 sodiums outside to every 2 potassium inside, and also there's more larger negatively charged particles inside, like these proteins. The overall resting membrane potential is more negative inside. We talked about this. And the standard usual is minus 70 millivolts for most. And the minus sign is telling you that the inner surface of that plasma membrane is more negatively charged with respect to the exterior. So membrane potential has this passive process where you have the sodium-potassium pumps, and you have the leakage gates, things going in and out. The sodium-potassium pump uses energy, but it's not like it's being stimulated to open and close. It's constantly doing that. And so the chemical gradients leak out and leak in and create electrochemical gradient. That's what they call this now. It's an electrochemical gradient because you have a difference in chemicals, sodium versus potassium, and a difference in charges. And the inside becomes more. There's something called an equilibrium potential, and basically what that is that the membrane potential, which there is no net movement of any ions. So naturally, sitting there looking at a cell at rest, there is a net movement of ions coming in and out. But there's a point where there's no net movement, and that's called equilibrium potential. And the potassium equilibrium potential is minus 90 millivolts, and the sodium equilibrium potential is plus 66 millivolts. So what that's saying is that when the membrane goes to minus 90 millivolts, there won't be any more movement of potassium in and out at that moment. It just kind of stops. And when the membrane goes to plus 66, there's no more movement of sodium for that moment. And plasma membrane is highly permeable to potassium, and this explains the similarity of equilibrium potential for potassium and resting membrane potential. So resting membrane's permeability to sodium is very low, so sodium has a small effect on resting membrane potential. So membrane potential is an active process across the membrane. The sodium-potassium pump is working all day long. We talked about that, ejecting 3 sodium ions out for every 2 potassium brought in. It actually is so important that it uses up to how much percent? 40% of resting cell energy is dedicated to that. So 40% of your resting cell's energy is dedicated to pumping out 3 sodium to every 2 potassium. And it balances the passive forces of diffusion and stabilizes resting membrane potential to minus 70 millivolts. That's resting membrane potential. When the ratio of sodium ions entry to potassium loss through passive channels, you have to realize the ratio is 3 to 2. So there's 3 sodiums going out, 3 going out of sodium. Oh boy, terrible. And 2 potassium coming in. And that ratio, the ratio of sodium entry to potassium loss is 3 to 2. So now the resting membrane potential exists because the cytosol differs from the extracellular fluid in chemical and ionic composition. The plasma membrane is selectively permeable, and the membrane potential changes in response to temporary changes in membrane permeability. The results from opening or closing of specific membrane channels can change that membrane permeability. The membrane permeability changes from opening and closing specific channels. And it's usually in response to a stimuli, mechanical, chemical, voltage. So sodium and potassium are the primary determinants of membrane potential. Sodium ions and potassium ion channels are either passive or active. Some are passive, some are active. The passive are called leakage channels. They're always open. The active channels are gated. They open and close at different stimuli. There are 3 types of gated channels, and chemically or ligand, so chemically or ligand gated, voltage gated, and mechanically gated. Chemically or ligand gated are stimulated by a neurotransmitter substance or a hormone to open. Voltage gated are opened and closed by a change in the membrane potential. And mechanically are opened and closed by some sort of mechanical stimuli. So again, chemically gated ion channels, also called ligand gated ion channels. They open when they bind to specific chemicals, such as acetylcholine, found on the cell body and dendrites of neurons. Voltage gated ion channels respond to changes in membrane potential, and they're found in axons of neurons and the sarcolemma skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle cells. The activation gate opens when stimulated, and the inactivation gate will close to stop. So when what happens is it's like a little thermostat. The temperature, instead of measuring temperature and turning on the air conditioning or the heat, when the temperature changes, when the voltage membrane changes in charge from its normal resting state, it will trigger the voltage gated ion channels to open. There's 3 possible states. You actually have closed but capable of opening. You have open, which means it's activated, and closed but incapable of opening because it became inactivated. So mechanically gated ion channels respond to membrane distortion, and it's usually found in a sensory receptor that responds to touch, pressure, or vibration. That's those proprioceptors we talked about. You know, when you moved your hand to touch your nose, it stimulated the movement. It told you where you're at. When your blood pressure is high, it tells the brain by stretching these baroreceptors. And then this is what a gated ion channel looks like. We saw this already. This is acetylcholine. This is a ligand-gated or chemically gated ion channel. And the chemical in this case will be acetylcholine. Here it is, going into the receptor. The gated ion channel opens, and then the sodium ions rush in. And then once you remove that, the gate closes. This is a voltage-gated ion channel that when the membrane changed from -70, all of a sudden it goes to -60, the gate opens. Now notice, here's a little something about voltage-gated ion channels. It has an outside gate and a backyard gate. Just like a corner house on a property, a corner property. I don't know if you've ever seen them. Sometimes people have a fence around the entire property on the corner and then a fence around the backyard. And there's a gate on each one of them. There's a gate for the backyard. There's a gate for the inside. So this is like the backyard gate right here, and it's always open. So the inactivation gate is always open at rest at -70 millivolts. But the outside gate's closed. You don't have to worry about the dog getting out because it's safe, right? But when you want to let the dog out, all you have to do is open the outside gate. And that's what happens when the voltage changes. It opens the activation gate. When the activation gate opens, sodium ions can now rush in. And it creates a more positive membrane, depolarizing the membrane. Sometimes it depolarizes so much that what happens is it actually goes too positive to +30. So then the inactivation gate closes to protect it from going any further. Okay, so this is a mechanically gated ion channel, and this one has, when the pressure, some sort of pressure is applied to the membrane, it opens the gate and the sodium ions rush in and depolarize. And then when you stop the stimulus, it closes back up. So membrane potentials. A graded potential, we learned, was only found in neurons, and it's more local. It changes the membrane potential that cannot spread far from the site of the stimulation, so it goes only a short distance. It can be produced by any stimulus that opens gated ion channels. An example, a resting membrane is exposed to a chemical. Chemically gated sodium ion channels open. Sodium ions enter the cell, and it creates a depolarization that travels a and so the sodium ions move parallel to the plasma membrane, producing a local current, and it can depolarize nearby regions of the plasma membrane, which is a graded potential. And this change in potential is proportional to the stimulus. So if the stimulus is really strong, it will go further and stronger. That's why they call it graded. So this shows you a graded potential, the resting membrane at -70 millivolts, and with a closed chemically gated sodium ion channels. Then something stimulates it. Spread of sodium ions along the inner surface produces a local current. The local current depolarizes adjacent portions, and it's going to travel to down the membrane, but sometimes it fades out and doesn't quite make it all the way over to here. So graded potentials, when they have repolarization, when the stimulus is removed, the membrane returns to normal. And then when you have hyperpolarization, it results from the opening of potassium ion channels. Those positive ions move out into the not into the cell, and the opposite effect of opening the sodium channels occurs, and this increases the negativity. So actually, it's a way of restoring the membrane potentials by opening the potassium ion channels. So the characteristics of graded potentials, the membrane potential is most changed at the site of the stimulation, and the effect decreases with distance. Just like if you were hitting a hammer on one of those things and try to ring the bell, that's the most power is right where you hit it, and it travels up, and it may not go all the way. The effect spreads passively due to local currents. The grade change in membrane potential may involve depolarization or hyperpolarization. It depends on the neurotransmitter substance. And the stronger the stimuli produce greater changes in membrane potential. So stronger the stimuli, greater the change in the membrane, and it can affect a larger area. So it's like, here's the platform, here's the bell, right? Guy hits it with a hammer, bam, and it travels up and doesn't quite make it. And then he hits it again, travels up, doesn't quite make it. And then he hits it again really hard, bing, and that's what we're looking for. We're looking to get a greater potential that is strong enough that when it hits a certain location called the trigger zone, we look at that. If it hits the trigger zone strong enough, it will cause an action potential. So here, a chemical synapse. This is a showing depolarization, repolarization, and hyperpolarization. So chemical synapse comes in, releases a stimulus of chemical neurotransmitter. It causes a depolarization event. And then when you remove the chemical, it starts to go back to normal, repolarizing. And sometimes a chemical stimulus that is actually designed to inhibit it can occur. So you can have like another neurotransmitter that's inhibitory that can create it go from -70 to -80. That's called hyperpolarization. But at -90, it will start coming back because of the potassium channel have this reset that if it hits -90, -90, it will trigger a repolarization back the other way. So action potentials are nerve impulses, and they're propagated changes in the membrane potential. So propagated means it's traveling, right? A propagation, it's not staying in one place. It's a membrane change that's traveling down the membrane. A slow depolarization, boom, 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 all the way. An effect of an entire excitable membrane, the whole membrane becomes depolarized. They begin at an initial segment of the axon. An action potential is different. Now we're talking about action potentials. It does not diminish as it moves away from the source, and it's stimulated by a greater potential that can depolarize the axonal lemma to threshold. The axonal lemma has to be depolarized at the trigger zone, and the threshold for an axon to have an action potential is -55. That's the one, but -60 to -55 is good. Normally it's memorized as -55. Okay, so this image is just reviewing the same thing. This is in your book, and it's going to go through how each neuron receives information. When that information is strong enough and it depolarizes this spot right here to -60, -55, it initiates the action potential. So sometimes the axon hillock is called the trigger zone. And at the trigger zone, it must depolarize to threshold, and threshold is -55 millivolts. Okay? So the trigger zone has to be depolarized to -55 in order to generate and propagate an action potential all the way down. So the all or none principle means that any stimulus that changes that membrane to threshold at that location will cause an action potential, and that action potential will travel all the way. Okay, so all action potentials are the same. No matter how large the stimulus, an action potential is either triggered or not. So they call that the all or none. So the generation of action potential, step 1, is a depolarization to threshold. Step 2 is the activation of voltage-gated sodium ion channels all along that membrane. Sodium rushes in. The inner membrane changes from negative to positive, resulting in a rapid depolarization from -70 towards 0, right? Now, in that case, it was -55 on the rest of it, right? So depolarization threshold is either -60 or -55. You know, I've always used -55, but -60 is fine too. The stimulus that initiates the action potential is a graded potential that brought this site right here. So let's say this came from the cell body and it traveled up to that spot at the axon hillock. Let's say that's the axon hillock right there. I'm going to make this bigger. This is the axon hillock, and it was strong enough to depolarize it to -60. Now what you're going to do down the rest of the membrane, it's going to have an action potential that will travel all the way. So the stimulus that initiates an action potential is a graded depolarization large enough to open these voltage-gated ion channels in succession down the entire length of the membrane. The entire length of the axon, one after another, like dominoes. And the opening of those channels occurs at the membrane potential known as threshold. When the sodium channel activation gates open, the plasma membrane becomes much more permeable to sodium ions, and it's driven by a large electrochemical gradient, whereas there's a lot more sodium outside and they rush in. The inner membrane surface now has become more positive in result, and then the negative ones. So, and the membrane potential is changed from -60 to a positive value. It goes all the way to a positive. Notice it's on this spot, it went all the way to +10 millivolts there. Step 3, the inactivation of the sodium channels. So you had this action potential going. Now you have to inactivate the sodium channels and then activate the potassium channels to try and bring it back to normal. So at +30, you know, you went from -70, right, to -55, right? And then it's getting more and more positive. We saw the image before, it went to +10, right? So, but if it gets to +30, inactivation gates open of the voltage gated, inactivation gates close of the sodium channels, and the voltage gated potassium channels open. So now we saw the double gate of the sodium ion channel. The inactivation gate was open all the time, but now that closes to stop the loss of the ions or the dog running out into the street, right? And now another thing opens is the potassium gated ion channels open. And when the potassium ion channels gate opens, the potassium moves out of the cell. And now that starts to create a repolarization towards that -70 number, right? We want to get to a minus number. We're in the +30 here, right? Remember, went to +30. So the key is you have two sets of gates. You have a sodium ion channel and potassium ion channel gates. The sodium ion channel gate had a double gate, had an outer and an inner, and the inactivation gate is the one inside. It's not closed, but the outside gate is open. The activation gate is closed. I'm sorry, it's open. It's closed, and when it opens, all the sodium rushes out. Now, when the sodium rushes out, sodium rushes in. Excuse me, it's late. When the sodium rushes in, the cell membrane is becoming more positive. And when it goes to +30, we gotta fix this. So the potassium ion channel gate allows for a correction, and the potassium ion channel gate's now open, and potassium moves out of the cytosol, causing a repolarization beginning. So here it is. Remember, this is the sodium ion channel gate right here. It has a activation gate and an inactivation gate. If you remember before at rest, the outer gate was closed and the inside gate was open. So the dog couldn't really get out in the street, but it was out in the front yard, so to speak, right? So this was always open and this was always closed. When you activated it and opened the activation gate, the inactivation gate, when we initially, this was closed and this was open at initial stage. When you opened this one, they were both open and sodium ions were rushing in. When it got too positive, it triggered it to close. And the two positive numbers plus 30, it closes this inactivation gate, the sodium inactivation gate. And at the same time, which was closed, the potassium ion channel gate was closed, it now opens and allows potassium ions to rush out. This is potassium. This is sodium. Okay. Okay, so this is rushing out. The potassium is rushing out. There's no more sodium coming in. So now it's going to start losing some of the positive ions. It's going to start getting close to normal again. So the generation of action potential is step 4, is return to resting membrane potential. The voltage-gated potassium ion channels begin to close as the membrane reaches normal resting potential. But what happens is potassium continues to leave the cell for a while, and it kind of overshoots it and makes it too negative. So the membrane becomes briefly hyperpolarized to minus 90 millivolts, which is potassium ion equilibrium. So after the voltage-gated potassium channels finish closing, the resting membrane potential is restored through the normal leakage channels and the sodium-potassium pump function. Here it is. There's a time lag in the closing of the potassium ion channels, and that actually causes it to become too negative inside. And that's called hyperpolarization if it becomes too negative inside. And that's minus 90 millivolts, which is equilibrium. That's the potassium equilibrium. Okay, and then back to normal resting minus 70 millivolts resting membrane potential. Now there's something called refractory period, and that's a time period. So a refractory period is from the beginning of the action potential to return to a resting state during which the membrane will not respond normally to any additional stimuli. So you have two types of refractory periods we'll see. There's a relative refractory period and an absolute refractory period. So the absolute refractory period is when all voltage-gated sodium channels are open or inactivated. The membrane cannot respond to any further stimulation during that time period. But there's a time period that begins when the sodium channels regain resting condition, and it continues until the membrane potential stabilizes. A stronger stimulus can initiate another action potential. So there's a relative period of time from the time that action potential is going where you can send another action potential that's stronger that can override the first one. But there is a period where it can absolutely not do that. That's a time period. It's just impossible to do it. So here's a nice chart. This is membrane potential, minus 70 millivolts at rest. A graded potential triggers an action potential. The action potential is traveling down the membrane, and then it's going to come back to normal. The sodium channels start closing, and it's starting to repolarize. So this is the depolarizing phase right here, and then this is the repolarizing phase. See how it, when it got to plus 30, it's actually triggered a repolarization because the sodium ion channels close, and then the voltage gated channels open for potassium. And then potassium ions move out, and it starts restoring the membrane back towards minus 70. But what happens is those potassium ion channels stay open a little too long, and that causes like an overshot, and it brings it to minus 90 millivolts, and that is the potassium equilibrium. And then those potassium ion channel gates will close and it'll eventually restore itself back to normal. So during these phases, we have a period of time here between the action potential from threshold to the peak of the action potential, and then back down towards the coming towards the restoration. This is a time where there's an absolute refractory period. You cannot overstimulate it again to get another action potential to go. But if you're in this stage, from this point here to this point here, you could get another action potential, and that's the relative refractory period. So I don't know if you could see that, is that this is absolute refractory period from point A to point B is absolute refractory period. And that means no other stimulus would actually give another action potential on top of that one and then override it. And the relative refractory period is from this point to this point. Okay. So now, depolarization results from an influx of sodium ions. We know that, right? The positive ions rushing in, making it more negative. Repolarization involves the loss of potassium ions, pushing out the excess positive ions of potassium. And then the sodium-potassium exchange pump helps to return the normal concentrations to pre-stimulus levels. So it maintains the concentration gradients of sodium-potassium over time. It uses 1 ATP for an exchange of 2 extracellular potassium ions for 3 intracellular. So every time you use 1 ATP, wow, 1 ATP, that's when you do 1 cycle of the sodium-potassium pump. And 1 cycle is 3 sodium out, for 2 potassium in. And the end result is you'll have more potassium inside and more sodium ions outside. And that set the stage for that whole events we just went through, is that if you open up different ion channel gates, one for sodium, one for potassium, it creates a change in the membrane. And so, like we said, without this difference in sodium and potassium, you can't have physiology. It would not occur. Nerves can't work, muscles can't work. So propagation has to do with the movement of an action potential along a membrane, and it's a series of steps. Now there's 2 types of propagation. There's continuous conduction or propagation, or saltatory propagation or conduction. Conduction or propagation can be used interchangeably. And that means there's an actual movement of a difference in polarity down the membrane, away. So in continuous conduction, what you're going to have an action potential as continuous propagation. It only occurs in unmyelinated axons. So one segment of the axon at a time is depolarizing slowly down the entire membrane. So the action potential developed at the initial segment first, and it depolarizes the membrane all the way to plus 30 millivolts. And a local current develops and depolarizes the second segment, and it goes down and creates a threshold, and it causes more depolarization down the membrane. So as an action potential develops at the initial segment, the membrane potential of this site depolarizes to 30 plus. So here's all the sodium ions rushing in. It creates a action potential. This is going to plus 30, and it's going to spread, and then it triggers this one to go. Once this hits minus 60, it will spread, and it'll keep going in the membrane. A local current then develops as sodium ions entering at 1 spread away from the open voltage-gated ion channels, and a graded depolarization quickly brings the axon membrane in the segment to threshold. So if you had a graded potential here, a local current, and it went to a specific site, it could depolarize that site to minus 60, and it travels. If it gets to that point where threshold will be met, And the point in that threshold is the trigger zone we talked about. That's at the initial segment. So a continuous propagation is the action potential to occur in the second segment. So basically what this is saying, the action potential occurs at one segment and it just depolarizes and then it repolarizes and it just travels down the membrane like that. A depolarization, repolarization, all the way down the membrane slowly, and it repeats itself. And action potentials can travel in one direction at 1 meter per second. So here you have a repolarization, which is refractory, and then you have a hyperpolarization here, and then it's going to depolarize here. It's just going to keep traveling down the membrane like that. So it's just a vicious cycle. It just keeps depolarizing down the membrane, triggering voltage-regulated ion channels to open, and then it repolarizes behind it. With saltatory conduction or propagation, it only occurs in myelinated axons, and the myelin actually is creating like a local current there, but what you don't really see it appears to look like it's jumping from node to node. If you remember the node of Ranvier in between each myelin, it seems to be depolarizing only here, here, and here. And it's true, but what happens, the way this myelin sheath works, it's actually sliding through like a gas puddle, like a puddle of gasoline being lit. So you spark here, and then it goes straight through, and then depolarizes here like a spark, and then it goes through. So a local current produces a greater depolarization that brings the axon membrane to the next node, to the next node, to the next node, and it's skipping, and that's why they call it saltatory conduction, and it's much faster than continuous conduction. But it's skipping. Now, the diameter of an axon affects the speed of the action potential. The larger the diameter, the lower the resistance, and the faster the speed. Larger diameter, faster speed. And then type A myelinated fibers, and then you have type B, and type C are non-myelinated. So there are types of axons based on the diameter, the myelination, and this propagation. Type A happen to be the fastest. They're myelinated, and they're biggest, thickest, and they go very fast. A type A myelinated fiber is large in diameter. It transmits information to and from the central nervous system rapidly. Okay, so from the CNS rapidly at 120 meters per second. That's like over 200 miles per hour. So for example, a sensory input such as balance and posture needs to be fast to give information to the brain to restore balance. And also motor impulses to the skeletal muscles to move. Think about running. When I took neuro and chiropractic school, I was trying to be faster at the sports I played. And, martial arts and playing rugby and running, especially running in sports, I wanted to be faster. And I wanted to try and figure out how I could be neurologically faster, because there is a neurological aspect to speed aside from physical aspects. So you have to be able to turn on and turn off muscles fast. And that is actually can be trained, believe it or not, to a certain degree. And it's about these myelinated nerves firing very fast. Type B fibers are myelinated, but they're medium in diameter, and they transmit speeds of up to 18 meters per second, which is like 40 miles an hour, maybe somewhere around there. And then type C fibers are unmyelinated, small in diameter, so they don't have any myelin. They're really slow, and 1 meter per second is like 3 to 5 miles per hour. And so the key is this is most sensory is actually very slow, if you think about it. But not when we're talking about the sensory of the skeletal muscle system. This is more for a sensory from the viscera. And that's what I always said. If you have pain in the abdomen or the viscera, and it's something that's been going on for a while. Okay, so the messages carried by nerves are routed according to priority. The critical information is transmitted through the type A fibers, like I said. That's really has to be fast. We need that sensory information about things that threaten our survival. And the motor commands have to be fast too to prevent injury.